Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Outsider. With you today is the editor-in-chief, that's me, Irina Zuckerman, and our guest today is Scott Morgan. He's a consultant analyst um, with Confused Eagle. He also writes for a variety of defense publications and specializes in West Africa. More recently, however, he has noticed an interesting trend in the rise of Brazil as France is leaving West Africa and Russia's um, pro-Russian groups and militias are moving in for security purposes. Now, with the Ukraine conflict raging and Russia moving some of its forces for reinforcement purposes to Ukraine and surrounding areas, it will be interesting to see what happens in terms of the security situation. In recent couple of months and several weeks, there's been a number of attempted and successful coups in several Western African countries. Um, how will Brazil take advantage of the situation? Will it be able to meet its growing interest in Africa as a major international player, or will it be challenged by these security conditions? And this is what we'll be discussing with Scott today. Scott, before we get into the issues with Brazil and how it came to be all of a sudden on the international arena competing with some of the other major players in Africa. Let's talk about the West African coups. What happened exactly? What is the common thread, and where do you see it all going?
Basically, what we're seeing, if there's a common thread, it generally falls along either two lines. Generally, it's either corrupt governments or their inability to provide services for their people. Like as in for what we saw in Burkina Faso, for example, what we saw was that the government was more apt to respond to an attack if it was targeting the gold mining industry instead of the general population. You saw the previous government respond to those events more quickly and more forcefully than other incidents where villages would be ransacked or attacked, people carried into captivity. You didn't see that much of a strong response by the previous government, in which also speaking of which, the Burkina junta has announced today that they're planning a 30-month transition to democracy, which is considerably shorter than the 5-year plan currently being planned by in neighboring Mali. So, us, those two things, generally those are the main factors. Either the government has been corrupt, take some money in off of on their side, or or they respond more to the whims of the multinational corporations than their own citizens. That is not always a good thing to follow.
And who is reportedly at least behind all these coups recently?
Generally, we're seeing that disgruntled members of the military, but there's also a caveat which people have been trying to use is that some of the coup planners and have actually been trained by the United States military, and that is a very loud voice here in Washington. You hear this a lot whenever one hears a conference because a little while earlier today, I was watching the USIP event regarding the factors behind the West African coups, and the seriousness of the factor that these some of these soldiers are actually trained by the U.S. actually came up. But as we know, we've seen other internal factors. The weak governance, the corruption, the inability, the corruption and basic failure to provide services to the population. has encouraged has encouraged these soldiers to take action, whether it's just or unjust. That is always that has been a factor, and other some cases we might see how they've been responding to the terror threats, but but the one question that has been asked is that regarding the relationship between the Mali junta and Wagner, are there outside forces also or pushing these coups? Somewhat I mean, some will actually make the same argument that France was behind the incident that led to the rise of W Sun in Chad. So, and money players, but outside influences, whether it's cash or whatever, cannot be totally ignored.
Well, in the past, France was a credible uh, potential culprit behind some of the past coups, especially in Mali, given that it had a vested interest in maintaining control. But with France withdrawing, it sounds like why would it want to continue pushing for political control in Chad if it's essentially running out of Africa?
I wouldn't totally say it's running out of Africa. It's been redeployment because some of the French units that have left Mali have not left Africa. You know, they've redeployed to Niger, they've redeployed to Burkina. It's expected that they could also be seen soon in both Senegal and the Central and Cote d'Ivoire. The issue that the Malians had, which is a very justified one, is that the French Operation Barkhane, the French mission, was focused more on dealing with the terrorists, which was a legitimate threat. However, they did nothing to support the Malian government in restoring some of the basic services. Like some of them, when I mean basic services, is like electrification projects in northern Mali, which even was the subject of a Millennium MCC compact with the United States. But after the 2012 coup, the U.S. backed away from it. That's another, mistakes like that were made because they actually thought that the jihadists were a more serious threat than actually improving the infrastructure and enhancing the lives of the people in northern Mali. It came back to bite Paris. It's in a huge way because we've even saw reports, French convoys, being disrespected by people in both Niger and Burkina Faso. you know, another thing that people generally don't realize is that when these countries became independent, and under using the Central African franc, these countries were required to deposit approximately 30% of their national treasury in French banks. That's a factor you generally don't hear people criticize enough. That is enough to some of the educated people, and even some activists here in the U.S. That's a moment of like, why isn't France being held accountable for this? I mean, why would they do that? Will there be any effort to transfer these funds back to these countries so they can actually go back to the rural electrification projects and improving agriculture, things like that these countries seriously need. And that if the France is not willing to engage, then other actors will step in. And besides Turkey, you're seeing the UAE make a presence there. You know, Brazil, as we will discuss further, Brazil, and they have an interesting way to get entering into Africa. That has been most interesting as well. So, and you have China also working. The U.S. is also working. So the West Africa and the Sahel region is going to be a very important geopolitical hotspot for the foreseeable future.
So France is still attempting to retain a semi-colonialist type model of influence. Meanwhile, Russia and Wagner Group have stepped in to displace where it faltered under allegedly security guarantee purposes. Now we are seeing that with the invasion of Ukraine, their presence may not necessarily last. There's been rumors that some of the Wagner presence has been called away and redeployed to Ukraine. What do you think is going to happen during these events?
I have heard those reports, because also people also should realize also in the region, Wagner also has a presence in Libya. They also have a presence in Central African Republic. There's a small presence in Guinea as well. The Qatar and Mali are the only countries that I've heard specifically mentioned for withdrawals. Haven't heard the mention of withdrawal from Libya. That is interesting as they prepare to have their presidential and parliamentary elections. But people also forget Wagner is more than just a private security company. They also do They also do mining. They're also active in the mining industry. So, as you know, some in the region, uranium is very plentiful in the region, as well as some rare earth minerals. You know, they have a presence in the diamond sector now in Car. And so basically, it's like what segment of Wagner is actually leaving instead of just the company, because due to the French activities, Wagner is still very popular in Mali right now.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of also economic activity that's going on under the radar that US in particular should be paying more attention to, between China going after rare earths in Africa, between Hezbollah and Iranian presence, interest in uranium and diamonds and gold, and now the Russians also going after some of these same things. There's quite a scramble for natural resources, and the US seems to be missing from this picture.
That it does, and that's one of the criticisms that people have about Africa. And other aspects of U.S. policy, it's heavily focused more on the security sector. That's a valid criticism. Certain countries have specific projects, with MCC, and USAID, and specific, targeting infrastructure projects like water, providing clean water, and other agriculture projects. So those seems to be the main U.S. focus, and not in resource except for oil, as you know, because right now one of the future emerging markets in petroleum and natural gas will be Senegal. I mean, they've actually been able to sell offshore blocks, and also we're starting to see some of those potentially will be coming online soon, and Senegal's also expanding its hydropower capacity. So despite and besides gold, the gold mining as well, but Senegal is actually economically a country I'm very high on in Africa.
And that's again something that other African countries such as Morocco understand very well, but the US seems to kind of not really appreciate economically. And this seems to me a big question, because we are having a gas price spike. President Biden is pushing Iranian oil as an alternative. Meanwhile, there are all these issues in Africa that economically could be quite advantageous to the US at the moment, and yet there is no effort to pursue them. Rather, there is a single-minded focus on the Iran deal to the exclusion of other economic opportunities, to speak nothing of political ones.
Agreed.
So in light of this event, it's no surprise that other actors are looking to take advantage of the vacuum of power, the shifting alliances, and these dynamics. Brazil, however, is a little bit of a surprise, not because it's a small or weak country. On the contrary, Brazil is considered to be a rising power, part of the BRIC uh, quad, so to speak. But because generally people think of more of Brazil just directly trading with some countries like Iran um, and not necessarily venturing abroad in search of resources and alliances, and nor expanding its influence beyond Latin America. What has changed, and how where did we miss this transition?
it's a it's a good question, but we'll start it off with one thing. When it comes to the arms trade, Brazil is one of the top 20 arms exporters. People, that often flies under the radar, and also, and you give credit, because Brazil's first foray into Africa was actually in the agricultural trade. Cocoa going to Africa, and then like nuts and other that fruits were going to Africa. And that started. Part of this we actually have to give credit to President Lula da Silva. He started this process first diplomatically, as you know. At one point, there were only 14 Brazilian embassies in Africa. Now there are over 30. Some of the embassies cover more than one country as well. But that all that process began under Lula da Silva, and that's when, and after the arm, and then with the, Brazil hosts its own arms show. So that's one way where the African militaries were actually seeing the products, put out by Taurus, which makes small arms, and Embraer, which makes the Super Tucanos. Because one thing that people haven't really have to really, another thing that people have to focus on is, we everybody has been hyped up about how the Super Tucanos were sold in a group of six to Nigeria through the with the U.S. being the intermediary, and everybody's like, "Wow, finally these planes are going to be used in Africa." It's not their first usage. In 2015, several planes were actually sold to Mali. Now the question is, when you're talking about the governance, were these planes being used by the Malian government, in counterinsurgency operations to take out the terrorists, or were the French using taking out the terrorists with their airstrikes? Some people would say that's splitting hairs, but that's a legitimate question. This platform has been used has been used successfully by the U.S. in Afghanistan, and now to see that they're being used in several African countries now shows the quality of the aircraft. And also, another country I mentioned Senegal in the past, in 2019, Brazil also sold some small arms to Senegal, which was like an $85,000 arms sale. So some of these are just like trade routes going back and forth. So like not just the Sahel, but also like the Gulf of Guinea, all the way down to even South Africa. The historical trade that's going on for how many hundreds of years. This should not come to a surprise to people that Brazil could become another major player in African affairs.
Uh,
And we're seeing Brazilian troops sent to Africa on peacekeeping missions. I know there were a couple of years ago there was some excitement that Brazil would actually go and send troops into the DRC as part of the UN mission. So, but that was fell through. But other South American countries like Uruguay have stepped forward there, and then you also see Honduras and Guatemala send their special forces to the Congo as well to support the peacekeeping there. So this should come as no surprise to some people, but it has not been free of controversy in the past because back when I was younger, and still serving in the Marines, there was a row between Brasilia and Washington because of a potential arms sale to Libya in the last days of the Reagan administration. It's going back and digging deep, and you just see how Brazil, has ambitious that they see good. They're seeing Africa as an expansion for all their markets, and to recognize one country in the Sahel specifically as a place to do business for the next fiscal years, it's just astounding. Especially, especially since this country needs the assistance. And I'm talking about Mauritania.
Why Mauritania?
That is great question. Location is the first thing I thought of. Close proximity to other conflict zones. Borders Mali. It borders Rio de Oro, or the former Spanish Sahara, which is part of Morocco, where in the past, the fighters that have been in the field against Rabat have actually used certain routes in Mauritania to smuggle arms to maintain the struggle, which have been provided by Algeria. It borders Algeria. Libya still remains a threat until they actually finally stabilize, and you had the militancy there. And it was interesting, that the new ambassador at large for religious freedom here in the United States, Rashid Hussein, his first overseas trip in his position, he went to Mauritania to attend a conference on peace.
That is a very curious choice.
It was curious. It was interesting. But it's a good choice because, when we talk about the rest of the countries, we see people focus on Mali, you see people focus on Niger, and also on Burkina and Chad. Very rarely do we hear about people going to Mauritania, country whose military has 10,000 troops in it, which is considerably small for a country that size, but it's important. Sits on various trade routes, and it realizes it cannot be isolated anymore because with the events, because you hear sometimes hear people talk about events in the region, because actually, to be honest, during today's event at the USIP, U.S. Institute for Peace, which I watched, had experts from the Heritage Foundation, Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and a couple other DC think tanks, focus more on Mali and Burkina, hardly any mention at all regarding of Mauritania, which some people say makes Brazil's move more curious, but I take the viewpoint. It's like finally someone's interested in Mauritania providing economic assistance, because basically the main, besides trade, I mean, most, has a small oil industry and fishing. That's what most people think of. That's all people think about Mauritania. But the other side is Mauritania is a known haven for slavery, and it has some very restrictive apostasy and blasphemy laws. So basically, Mauritania is actually in a good position. Maybe the thought process could be, how do we keep Mauritania from falling into the situation like Mali, like Burkina, and like Niger? Chronic instability, jihadist presence, and other concerns. So that is all, so I mean that could be it, And we also know that Erdogan is also in Africa this week as well. So, and he's not scheduled to go there, but he's going to be in the region as well.
That's really funny that you mentioned it, because Erdogan was just in UAE. UAE in the last few years has been a very major factor in Mauritania. They've sort of displaced Qatar as one of the major Middle Eastern influences there. Now Turkey and the UAE are trying to make peace, and previously they were competing over hearts and minds in all these African countries. So how that's going to play out in Mauritania? What you know, uh, in where does Brazil stand in all of this in terms of these seemingly previous rivals who are trying to now cooperate on a number of economic matters?
I think Brazil plays this way because traditionally they've always sought to work with other Lusophone states, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. Those were their primary focuses, but I also think, you know, some people will focus on their arms, as I mentioned, their arms sector and the high quality of their merchandise that they've been providing because the A-29 Super Tucano is considered the world's finest aircraft dealing with counterinsurgency operations. And the in Brazil in the agriculture sector has actually been doing well. So and also and like everything is like Brazil's probably may taking the same position as we're seeing Turkey has, as well as the UAE is like, hey, we're a viable option here. We can help you out without dealing with the heavy-handed presence of the U.S., the EU, and Russia.
So that raises an interesting question. Brazil is part of this attempt by Russia, India, China to Iran and China to India and China to kind of uh, push back against more traditional powers. Um, now now we're seeing some of these alliances have shifted in interesting ways. Russia, China, and Iran have formed their own axis. India is trying to balance between the US and its traditional relationship with Russia. Brazil under Bolsonaro have tried, has pursued a more pro-Western kind of position. Where do you think it's going, especially if Bolsonaro loses power in the future? Will Iran's been actively trying to make a comeback in Brazil, not that it ever fully left, but under Bolsonaro, its presence diminished. And now you see some of these actors playing a role in Africa as well. India is not quite looking to project its own influence, but it's also a major growing global market and also a major growing consumer of arms and other products. So what how do you see Brazil playing out against these relationships?
The best way they can do it, they'll present themselves as a viable option to these other ones. Is like we won't place the restrictions on human rights as we've seen from the West. Um, we will help you build things up like what they're offering to do to Mauritania. Building up the defense sector because this was actually this the move into Mauritania is a public-private partnership. We should also remember that it's just you know we Brazil sees that as a place where they could do business and also expand business because one of the main criticisms of Brazil, specifically when they're arms trade, has been the murkiness of their exporting licenses. And, because they're so vague, human rights groups can't really tell, like having end users, if they're using end user certificates or not, whether or not they're going to be going to government or insurgent forces that are from another country that are there. So basically, that's one thing that will always have that will always create the position if you're a human rights activist or a person like that or following the arms trade. That will always raise a level of concern. Is like, what are they actually doing? What are they actually providing? And that's found. And also, Brazil was also one of the traditional leaders of the G77 countries, which is a group of 77 or the non-aligned movement at the United Nations that basically try to, it's like they didn't want to be seen as too friendly to the United States and Europe, but they also didn't want to be too friendly to the communist bloc as well back during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, if they say, we already have a path, let's just follow it, saying we can go, we can help you with this. You won't have to deal with you won't have to deal with the Europeans, you won't have to deal with Russia, China, or whoever, but we want to help you. It's a it's a simplistic outlook that some will say, but for them, it's actually working. Brazil is actually, Brazil is a rising power, looking to expand their market space around the world, and and it's not really much of a surprise to see all this is always back to trading routes that have existed, policies before Columbus.
Do you see Russia and China viewing Brazil's expansion in Africa as a threat, or do they, for the time being, are liking it just do its own thing and are not really concerned because they have a different set of interests?
That that itself is a great question. You haven't really seen any Russian criticism yet of the move into Mauritania because, as you know, money is money. It's Russia has Russia has always has been interested right now. It seems its main goals right now in Africa seem to be keeping on in Central African Republic, doing what they can to assist the junta in Mali, and trying to support their clients in Libya. Those are the things that agendas that we do see. We don't see how other countries, as exist with other potential trouble spots, like the Morocco, Algeria tensions.
Mm-hmm.
Those are could get hot. We're seeing militants also spreading south towards the Gulf of Guinea. We've seen attacks in Benin. Cote d'Ivoire has always been a major concern. What will happen when? How will the situation in these countries develop in the future? We don't know yet. Will Russia have a role? Will the U.S. still maintain a role? Because right now, Flintlock is still going on right now, and it has been scaled back. It's like 10 countries. I wasn't, like the Sahel Five pretty much, they were not invited. Like Senegal was not invited, but we invited Nigeria, Cameroon, a couple other. There's like 10 countries. Flintlock only has 35. Now, is this because of COVID, or is this a general sign of like we're not interested in Africa anymore by this administration? We can't, we're told that the adults are back in charge in Washington, but Africans saw the debacle in Afghanistan as well, so they probably doubt the seriousness of anything that this administration says to them. So that's why you're also seeing other countries like Turkey, which right now, which are shopping their drones because they're used so effectively in Libya and in Azerbaijan. You see the UAE, which can do so much, in the infrastructure for any oil and natural gas field, and and one of the things is that what makes Turkey unique also is that
I can't hear you. I lost you for a second. The sound is not coming to me. I lost the sound.
those are things that the Africans are looking at, and they're going and they see these moves by they see these moves by Erdogan. They see the UAE making visits as well, and you're seeing Brazil showing interest. Like Africans are saying, "Hey, we have other options now."
Exactly. Uh, so where do you see all of that going in terms of the recent instability in Western Africa? Do you see Brazil trying to be more of a stabilizer? Do you see them being opportunistically selling weapons to everybody or siding with a particular party? What role will it have, if any?
I'm sorry, Rena, I didn't catch the first part of that. Can you repeat it?
In light of this rising instability in other West African countries and all these recent attempted coups, what role do you see Brazil playing? Will it stay out of it? Will it opportunistically sell weapons to everybody? Will it try to be a stabilizer? And what do you think it will do?
Probably, I actually see them as being a stabilizer.
Hmm.
Providing another way. Besides like what the response by the West, which can be either heavy-handed in response or figure that if they throw enough money at the issue, the problem will go away. Or we'll see China will just see that and it's like, hey, we you have something we like, we'll just give you a bunch of cash and we'll just take what we want. Similar activities by can be said about Russia as well. But which is probably what if Brazil puts people on the ground and said, "This is how you can build this industry. This is how you can actually improve infrastructure, other things like other and other aspects that need improvement." That's Brazil can make that argument. UAE can make that argument. But I think Erdogan's just there basically, to prop up his kleptocratic family because we know most of the major Turkish media outlets and military providers are actually controlled by members of his extended family. So
Under Biden, the US relationship with Brazil has been relatively low key, and that's an understatement, probably. Um,
really because Bolsonaro was so close to Trump. I mean,
mhm.
and they're supposed to have elections later soon. And the question, we could see Lula da Silva back in power. And if that's the case, we could actually see a change in the U.S. Brazilian relationship because of politics.
It's funny, Biden has been actively trying to interfere and intervene in the political processes in other Latin American countries. Do you think this that the administration will in some way meddle with the Bolsonaro administration to displace them?
That could be. I can actually see the administration doing what they can. At least through words saying how we support, Lula da Silva. Partly all they'll probably say is, Bolsonaro is another Trump. He's done bad for Brazil and he has to be removed. And and you look at that and you look at how fast the rehabilitation of Lula da Silva was, how quickly they moved. Releasing him from prison, expunging his record, allowing him to be a candidate for this cycle, which, according to exit polls, he's currently in the lead over President Bolsonaro.
Yes.
And so we know this administration will find him to be someone that they are willing to work with.
I wonder if the kind of goal of normalizing Iran and welcoming Iran to Latin America even more so than it already is can bring these two administrations potentially together even more than the general kind of economic outlook.
Same could be said from Argentina because with the issues with Argentina and their past relationships, with the uh, especially with the incidents with the attacks on the synagogue and the cultural center.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and you could actually see the White House trying this White House doing what they can to try and restore good ties between Argentina and Brazil.
That should also be an interesting uh potential development. Not sure if it's going to be optimal for the U.S. interest if both countries have very leftist governments at the helm and very pro-Iran governments. Bringing these countries together at that stage might not be a very good idea. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure what US will get out of it on a national level.
Besides the fact that these actions will probably could cause in the views of some a scene then the left wing governments at doing what in Brazil and Argentina doing what they can. Will they replace Venezuela as a main security threat in South America?
Well,
Well, I mean that's something if Lula da Silva wins, you'll have some people in this city thinking that.
Brazil is potentially a far more powerful actor than Venezuela, especially since a significant portion of Venezuela has fled the country and is essentially destabilizing Colombia and nearby lying states. Um, all in all, a very potentially um, concerning potential trend. You mentioned that Brazil, in its current role, has also gone in terms of Africa as far as South Africa in terms of its economic relationships. Now, South Africa has also been growing increasingly close to Iran, especially economically. What do you see happening? Do you think South Africa will continue growing its relations with Brazil, especially if a more left-leaning government replaces Bolsonaro?
It's it could basically right now you see one of the main issues about South Africa is that they are going to have major economic issues soon. We've we've heard about the crime, and the failing infrastructure, and they just announced today that they're going to deploy more troops into Mozambique. So that will place more of a strain on the South African economy. It's pretty much almost ironically like what happened in Zimbabwe. One of the when they tried to do the land reform, they actually had a brigade of the Zimbabwean army as well as using fighter aircraft during the conflict in the DRC, which is one of the factors why the land reform program that they tried to do failed miserably and led to the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. Could this happen again in South Africa with the forces being being deployed to Mozambique? Because also another country which is close and borders South Africa, Eswatini, still has had their share of internal strife, with protests against the king and members of the opposition being arrested and forced into exile. We haven't seen any moves yet into Eswatini. We did see South Africa and troops go into Lesotho to restore order about 18 months ago. So South Africa economy is beautiful, but the economy is teetering in it, and people have yet to realize it, are starting to realize it. And and the deployments to South into Mozambique will not help matters.
We are seeing increasingly the competition in various arms markets. Brazil, as you mentioned, uh, is selling a great deal to African countries, but in terms of breakthrough innovation, we are hearing so far much more from Turkey. We know that UAE and Saudi Arabia are both trying to develop their own industries. UAE just came through with a groundbreaking new mechanism to respond to Houthi drones and other aerial attacks. Um, what innovations can we expect from the Brazilian market, or do you see them specializing more on kind of very traditional types of weapons and not really going into kind of hybrid war territory?
That will depend because, as you know, as the technology evolves, as we're still going to have for some time, we're still going to have grunts on the battlefield, so they'll still provide small arms. The A-29 is still very popular in the counterinsurgency operation field. I mean, and it depends on what else.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now, Arena?
Yes.
Yeah. Go back. The use of UAVs in Libya and Ethiopia have been a boon to Turkey, and Iranian drones have also been seen in Ethiopia as well as the UAE. Though those factors have helped those countries, like providing platforms, the equipment and everything, and radars. Like the A-29 has been the biggest thing, as well as tactics as well. So we shall. I think. I think Brazil will, as the market expands, Brazil will do it because Brazil does have a once yearly arm show where they show off their wares. They had Brazil was also at the Dubai was at the Dubai Arms Show last year, and they were at the Singapore Air Show that just recently concluded as well. So
But we are so far focusing on Turkey so much that we are ignoring these competitive markets. What do you think is the potential for this um, kind of going in a different direction? And by the way, one of the reasons we're hearing so much about Iran and Turkey is because their influence in those countries is not perceived to be particularly constructive at the end of the day.
that is true. You generally you generally don't hear of any strife within Brazil.
Hmm.
There's still some issues with the Amazonian rainforest, but you know, both Turkey and Iran are in poor economic conditions.
Hmm.
As we can see how adamant they are to have the U.S. drop sanctions before any new JCPOA regarding Iran is formed. Plus, they have GLOMAG and other types of sanctions that have been issued against Iranian players. Is not we haven't seen that much on Turkey, but even though the lira is in bad shape, but you hear about these Turkish arms sales, and you wonder, and that's why you have people state that Turkey's a hypocrisy because if the central bank, if they're making all these monies in arms sales, but yet the central bank's still in dire straits, where's the money going? I mean, you'll see conversations like that, but as Turkey's been aggressive with its policies, but and Brazil, has been more nuances. Like, yeah, You have this, wow, it's good. We can set up diplomatic relations. Now we can help with, now they're at the stage that we can help you defend yourselves.
And what do you think is the next step for Brazil after Mauritania? Now that they've kind of entrenched themselves there, where do you think it will go next?
That's a great question. In, Nigeria, Nigeria could be a place where where they've done business in the past. Same with Egypt and South Africa. I mean, could they go in? We generally haven't heard much of what type of business they've actually done with Mozambique.
Hmm.
You know, and with the situation in Tanzania, Kenya, and Somalia, that could be an interesting avenue. No, Turkey, Brazil, if they provide equipment or whatever, and in return, Brazil gets access to energy.
The other African country, of course, that we should not forget about that Mauritania has been engaging with, or is considered a target country, is Egypt. Egypt has purchased a great deal of weapons from France and Italy, recently also some from the United States. But it has been also shifting away from Russia, which has supported Ethiopia in the recent uh, tensions over GRD and other issues. Do
And
you
Brazil,
see?
they have been known to be a client of Brazil for weapons as well.
Mhm. What
One thing,
types of weapons are we looking at here?
according to SIPRI, the weapons in charge were actually small arms, mostly rifles.
Mhm.
Rifles, Taurus is known for firearms.
Mm.
But what I'm actually interested in seeing is if a restorative government is in place later this year in Libya, could that relationship be reestablished again? And
In Libya.
Gaddafi tried to purchase arms from them back in 1988.
Mhm.
Could a stable Libya be the next client for Brazil, considering they tried to do it in the past and it did incur the anger of the United States. That did happen in 1988. What would happen if they started to reestablish that process again?
Why would they need to wait for Libya to be united to do that, though? Especially since it looks like they're back on the verge of a potential conflict after the elections did not work out.
That's a fair assessment. That would be a judgment call on the Brazilian part, and probably who reaches out to them first.
Mm-hmm. Um,
Uh, the
yeah, I
best
mean, the half the people have been trying to shift away from dependency on Russia and actually looking for ways to get rid of the Russian presence altogether and to find some other security guarantee. When you mentioned Brazilian peacekeeping forces in various other countries, I wonder whether Brazil could at some point displace the Wagner presence in another groups in Libya, if nothing else, even in the event that a unity government is not in the works for the time being.
it doesn't have to be Libya itself. We could there are other hotspots. Central African Republic. South Sudan's another country that needs stabilization. They could go there.
Interesting point. I wonder how much Brazil is willing to kind of expand its direct kind of people to people influence in terms of these peacekeeping and stabilizing forces versus just direct armed trade. How much of a defense relationship building is it actually willing to do? Because arms trade is one thing, but defense relationships are completely different form of influence. What do you see from that so far?
That is true. That I mean, because that was one of the thoughts I was had when the relationship with Mauritania was first announced, because when I first heard it, I was actually surprised. I was, pleasantly surprised, because, of the general isolation of Mauritania. I mean, they're generally seen as an afterthought in the Sahel Five and other groupings. And we're seeing what happened with Mali and Burkina. It's like, this is going to be interesting to see, especially if it works out.
Mhm. Absolutely. And what about some of the major conflicts that are ongoing in the Horn of Africa right now? First of all, do you see them spilling over to the West at some point, in terms of at least some of the kind of jihadist elements trying to take advantage of these instability conflicts? And do you see Brazil getting involved in any of them in any way?
Being involved in what's going on with, like, the Ethiopia crisis and Somalia and Kenya, don't visually see that yet. I've put word is yet. We don't know how what type of contacts have been made. As far as the activity spreading west, I what we've been seeing in that region, is that they're not actually heading west. They're actually heading south.
Hmm.
Because we know that some of the militants in Mozambique have now been launching raids into Tanzania as well, and that generally has not been made public by Western outlets yet.
That's unfortunate because that could potentially be yet another wildfire to deal with in yet scarier.
And the UN has suspected that there are links between the jihadists in northern Mozambique and those in the eastern DRC. So if you're using that as a route for the questioning, I could see that, but it
Yeah.
seems like they're moving south,
Mm-hmm.
or in some cases, and you have others moving north. But the question is, will ADF continue moving east? Because we know in the past ADF assisted Al Shabaab with the bombings in Kampala during the 2010 World Cup. So that is a very pessimistic outlook in the view of Osama. It's like, yeah, they've done it before. Why, it's about time for them to do it again.
It's certainly possible. So far, I don't see any country that claims to try to play a major role in Africa come up with any grand strategy for stabilizing any of the regions. And certainly with West Africa, we see more exploitation and temporary relationship, kind of really ad hoc relationship building, than any strategic investment into a general area kind of um, cooperation. Do you see any of that changing in the near future? Certainly, probably not from Biden, but from any of the other actors.
No, all this seems to you're right. All these actions and moves seem to be transactional. They fit a purpose. It's like, we can help them, but we can also strengthen our position overall. That seems to be the train of thought in the views of some people. Will it change? I actually doubt it. I mean, resolving some conflicts, specifically one in Libya, will go a long way to stabilizing the Sahel, and will also go, stabilizing Nigeria as well. Will also be a good way to piggyback off that. But was the inability of the Niger of those of not what's going on in Nigeria, where attacks are daily now. And those attacks seem to be spreading. The attackers seem to be spreading to the west, which is a disconcerting sign as well. It's like you could get the view like they're moving west to support their fellow actors in Mali, Burkina, whatever. As also as we see them also move south, launch raids in Benin, which I wrote about just before Christmas. And Cote d'Ivoire is another country that people are actually concerned. But then you had the other two. What about Togo and Ghana? Those are, though they have common borders with these countries as well. But we don't see any concerns raised yet, except for Ghana, where they also, they just had elections. So we shall see. I mean, it's one of the things. And then the other concern is because in those countries, the major focus is piracy. Another thing is, as you said, as you asked earlier, next time, how soon will we see Brazil, send a warship or two into the Gulf of Guinea to curtail acts of piracy? That could be a next step.
Why? What would be its interest in doing so?
It's, partly due to trade. It'd be the one, and also it could all that's the main reason. It's trade because of the security. And we're also talking waters that are not that far away from Brazil. And that's the one factor because you're seeing the overfishing in the Gulf of Guinea. It's starting to cause problems, and it'd probably be easier for Brazil to address it now before the pirates start venturing further out into the Atlantic to attack commercial shipping. Because as you know, before the Somali pirates were actually dealt with when they sent the multinational task force, they were ranging as far south as Tanzania and up almost towards the Strait to Oman and the Straits of Hormuz before the people decided, wait a minute, we got to deal with this.
Interesting. Brazil's role in maritime security, could be also tied into other issues as well. You mentioned trade. Do you see Brazil joining the energy and rare earths kind of game afoot in Africa, or do you see them essentially not necessarily needing to rely on those as much and essentially just continuing to just engage in trade with the countries that can provide them?
Well, as you know, trade comes first, then comes the defense cooperations. It's almost like every country in the world history has done that. Done that in the world. The British, the Dutch, and the British were exceptional at it. The U.S. has not been that bad at it as well. It has worked. But other countries have taken a more militaristic approach. Turkey's doing it. Just by military contacts. Japan did it before the Second World War because the military was literally running the country. So it's one of those things. Sometimes it's a case of who is calling the shots.
And in terms of its leadership position vis-a-vis all of these countries, where do you place Brazil now?
Brazil is actually in the top 5 outside the general spheres of influence. I still lump Turkey with NATO. So I generate now as realms of influence. I have UAE is number 1. Then I put Brazil number 2. Then followed by Egypt. It still has some influence. Then KSA, and then India, although India is going to be another interesting country to watch as these situations continue to unfold.
Sooner or later, India, which has been focused on domestic, issues, will start pushing back against Chinese influence with more kind of active measures. I think it's only a matter of time. The question is, of course, how much time before China gains control of everywhere. But if India could potentially on the one hand have that option, but on the other hand, it will eventually need its own resources and it will look for actively searching for them in Africa and elsewhere. It could be another competitive factor, and it's still can't hear.
So now is right now, Africa is going to, it's almost like history is rhyming again. Africa, you had the colonial power seeking the colonized, access for trade and natural resources. And it's ironic that not even a little more than 100 years later, the the more advanced countries in the world are actually going back there for the resources.
As and despite attempts to for self-governance, post-colonial countries have actually many of them have done very poorly. First of all, the meddling, outside meddling, did not stop. Second, the communist kind of parties were corrupt and economically unhelpful, and of course, tribal and religious issues were also never fully resolved. So this confluence of factors did not help and made it easy for external parties to take advantage of the situation, for sure. Whether or not any of them can become stable enough to help others around them and to overcome this kind of exploitation and kind of turn it more into partnerships and opportunities, that's the big question.
That it is because one thing about Mali, for one point, it was considered to be a bastion of democracy in West Africa. And then you had, the increasing corruption, which led to both the rebellion and the military coup, which literally, which wrecked the government. And then for a period of time, with little or no assistance from anybody else, they were actually able to organize a couple presidential elections and also for parliaments. And then with virtually no help from anybody else. And then it just and then events just happened where the military was forced to take over and the country backslid. Burkina, this is all about resources. The same with Niger. So it's a lot of these issues have not been easily resolved. They probably won't be easily resolved. But but when a country's trying to do these things and ignored by the UN and other actors, it does cause one's dander to raise.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the groundwork with grassroots building up of stable societies, laws, and enforcement of anti-corruption kind of processes, it has to have some outside assistance and guarantor, because at this rate, the top level approach is just not working.
Of course, and then you also have a factor of countries with middle-aged or advanced age leaders and with very youthful populations, that are tech savvy.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and their voices are not being heard, and that raises risk.
We've heard a lot about the North-South divide, but now as we're seeing countries that were once considered part of the global South play an increasingly active international role, I wonder if this dynamic will shift, whether they can provide a better perspective from the point of view of some of these developing countries in terms of coming in from similar types of experiences and being able to bring in that sort of kind of more relatable perspective. So far, we are seeing that, other than Russia, China, and countries like that, some of the Latin countries have been, most of them have not been quite developed enough to play that game yet. But Brazil is a possibility, and potentially in the future, Argentina could become another one of those players, but that also remains to be seen.
So same with Colombia.
In Colombia, yes, for sure. Would be curious with an increasing diversity of international actors and with Europe taking a backseat, especially with the energy crisis and complete mismanagement of various policies. I wonder if eventually a confluence of several leading African and Asian and Latin countries will completely displace Europe in terms of economic and political gravitas.
Well, we're seeing this some with the political gravitas. I mean, all you have to do is watch the UN Security Council session the other night, and the remarks by the Kenyan ambassador were just,
That was unbelievable, really.
because Kenya's always been Kenya's also a country where it's, they've had some issues with elections, but generally, they stand up a lot. When the first coup happened in 2012, the country that sent the EU sent an envoy to Mali, and it was actually the Kenyan vice president. That was the first. That was the first envoy. And so Kenya will be a country that everybody looks up for.
Hmm. Fascinating. It remains to be seen whether some of these countries will eventually break away from international structures that are not supportive of their interests, like the UN, like to some extent IMF, and become their own military defense and economic blocks that are kind of more formalized and maybe function differently, or if not better than the current structure, some of which go back to post World War II order and efforts at bringing in stability, and essentially have become corrupted, went on mission creeps, or just developed different interests.
That will be interesting. We seen blocks as like, will ECOWAS be a factor? Because the coups in West Africa and their different responses to the different coups will cause people to scrutinize their actions more, even though a lot of people approved of their way when they went into Gambia and removed Jama. They've done well regarding, but they have a hit or miss record right now regarding what's happened in Mali. But they've been actually pretty good in working with Burkina Faso about reestablishing a dialogue. So, and will we see ECOWAS as a major player? Yes. I mean, with the Horn in the Horn of Africa, you have IGAD. You know, their you know their failure to address the situations in both South Sudan and Somalia have left a lot to be desired right now. But but I guess relatively new, not even a decade old. So they're they're learning about how to address some of these issues.
Will be definitely something to watch. I think another program in the near future, but the emergence of new political and defense blocs and alliances is definitely for good to put on the agenda. This was really fascinating. I think a lot of people will hopefully be watching for Brazil and its role in the markets. It's also doing a lot in the Middle East with Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. In terms of defense agreements, we shall see whether it will develop a longer term relationships, especially since Russia and China have not proven to be particularly great allies, and they're causing problems with the US, whereas Brazil is sort of in the middle of everything and does not necessarily have any particular disapproval from anybody. We will see whether they can in the future replace some of the more problematic actors, while also potentially competing with the US for influence.
That is so true. And as we haven't seen over the past few years, the most problematic actors are often the most loudest.
Mhm. Brazil has been coming into this relatively quietly, but steadily. So that's something to watch out to. Will they become much more visible, and how soon?
Yeah, I mean, their efforts become more visible like by expanding their diplomatic presence in embassies in Africa. Oh, during Lula da Silva's term, they're starting, they're starting to see the benefits of it.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I think closer to the elections or right after the elections, we should probably have another discussion regarding the potential shift or not, depending on the likely outcome, whether there is going to be a continuity in policy or whether the return of previous actors will mean a major shift. So we'll be on the lookout for that.
We will.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you everyone who watched the Washington Outsider today. We had Scott Morgan discussing Brazil's growing role in West Africa and how it can manage the instability and the coups and all these challenges and still emerge with political and economic gains. Thank you so much and stay tuned for our future programs.
Thank you.